Excuse me, are you sure you're at the right table? I'm here with the woman beside me. Right, the spouse. I don't think we've been formally introduced.
Please, don't make this into something.
I'm not trying to embarrass anyone. I just think people should be where they belong. This table runs on real numbers, real stakes. You do freelance consulting, is that right? That's right. I respect the hustle, I do. But some rooms have a floor, a financial floor. You understand, it's nothing personal. None taken. You're not rich enough to be here.
That night, Wyatt Corbett humiliated me in front of every senior leader at Stonebridge Freight, and my wife stood nearby and said nothing. He read the badge on my chest like a verdict, a freelance consultant, a +1, a man with no business being there. What Wyatt didn't see was what I didn't say. I straightened my cuff and watched him work the room. Somewhere across the city, a document had been sitting in a trust for 12 years, one with his name written all over the consequences. And he had just signed his own permission slip to find out. If you've ever been underestimated by someone who only knows how to measure people by what they display, stick with this one. This story is for you. And if you haven't already, subscribing to the channel takes 2 seconds and means you won't miss what comes next. The badge said spouse guest in clean black letters, and I wore it without argument. That was the thing about Wyatt Corbett. He assumed silence meant surrender. He'd watched me walk into the Monarch Ballroom that evening with nothing on my lapel worth impressing anyone. No firm name, no title. Just a laminated rectangle that announced exactly what I was in relation to the room secondary. An accessory. Someone's +1. And because he read people the way certain men always do, by what they display rather than what they carry, he thought he already knew everything about me that mattered. I was wrong, but I wasn't going to correct him that night. Stonebridge Freight Group held its annual leadership dinner at the Union Exchange every year in late November, and every year Valerie came home from it a little more distant, a little more convinced that the life we were living wasn't quite enough. The event was billed as a celebration of company performance. In practice, it was a sorting mechanism, a room designed to remind everyone exactly where they stood. Wyatt had seen to that. He'd quietly established an unspoken rule that the center tables, the ones under the chandeliers, the ones with the better wine and the longer tablecloths, were reserved for people with a net worth above $20 million. No one announced it. No one had to. Everyone just knew. I had known Stonebridge from a different angle for 12 years. Back when the company was hemorrhaging money and couldn't guarantee payroll past 6 weeks, I had brought something they desperately needed, a routing optimization system. I'd spent 4 years building and enough personal capital to buy them time. I didn't do it out of charity. I did it because I saw what the company could become, and I wanted a stake in that future. What I got was 87% of Stonebridge Freight, held through a legal structure called the Palisade Stewardship Trust, managed by my attorney Lydia Sutton. My name appeared nowhere in the company's public filings. My face appeared at none of the board meetings. To every employee in that building, including the woman I'd been married to for 8 years, I was simply Martin Keaton, freelance supply chain consultant, reliable but unremarkable. I had chosen that deliberately, and for a long time I believed it was wisdom. I wanted to know the company was being run honestly, without managers performing for the majority shareholder. I wanted to know whether Valerie had fallen in love with me, or with what I could have given her if she'd known. The arrangement felt clean when I first designed it. It felt less clean standing in a ballroom with a laminated badge on my chest while my wife looked the other way. Valerie had changed over the past 2 years, gradually, and then all at once. She'd always been ambitious, which I respected. But somewhere between the corporate retreats and the private dinners and the constant proximity to people who measured everything in visible increments of wealth, her restlessness had curdled into something harder. She started keeping her phone face down when I walked into a room. She mentioned Wyatt in conversations where his name had no business appearing. She came home from Phoenix in October and was quiet in a way that wasn't tired. It was careful. I noticed all of it. I didn't say anything yet because I had learned over the years that some truths reveal themselves cleanest when you don't reach for them. Wyatt Corbett was everything designed to impress a certain kind of ambition. He wore the kind of watch that gets noticed without being pointed at. He spoke about money the way people speak about weather casually, as though it were simply the atmosphere everyone moved through. He had told Valerie more than once that a woman in her position deserved a partner who could stand beside her, not behind her. He said it gently. That was the skill of it. He framed her husband's ordinariness as her misfortune, and she had started to believe him. 8 months before that dinner, they had started an affair in Phoenix. They used company phones, company hotel rooms, company calendar entries that listed meetings that never happened. I didn't know the details yet, but I knew the shape of what was gone. Inside Stonebridge, something else had been building for longer than any of that. Denise Harper ran the compliance analysis division, and she was meticulous in the way that makes certain people very good at their jobs and very inconvenient to the people around them. Over the course of 30 months, she had identified a pattern in the freight subcontracts that Wyatt managed. 3 vendors kept appearing companies with thin histories, inflated billing, and a curious immunity to the standard vetting process. Fuel surcharges that didn't match market rates. Storage fees for shipments that, according to logistics records, had never been stored. The discrepancy she'd documented crossed $1.8 million and was still climbing. Denise had done everything right. She wrote her first report and sent it to Frederick Morrow, the CEO. Frederick called her into his office, told her she was misreading the procurement process, and sent her back to her desk. When she submitted a second report with additional documentation, he added a note to her personnel file suggesting she had overstepped her functional boundaries. After the third report, he approved 2 more contracts from the same vendors she had flagged. He didn't do this by accident or negligence. He did it because Wyatt had made him a promise that when the sale of Stonebridge's Western Logistics division went through, Frederick would walk away with a severance package that would make the rest of his career irrelevant. All Frederick had to do was keep the right doors open and the right questions unanswered, unable to get any response through internal channels. Denise sent everything to the independent whistleblower line managed by Lydia's office. I read every page of her reports. I had been sitting on them for weeks, waiting until Lydia had enough to move without triggering chaos inside the company. That caution, I would come to understand, was the most costly decision I made in this entire story. The ballroom at the Monarch was already full when Valerie and I arrived. I noticed it the moment we walked in, the way Wyatt moved toward her, not toward both of us, the way he already knew which wine she preferred, the way his hand found the small of her back as he steered her through the crowd with the ease of long habit. Valerie didn't redirect him. She just moved with it. I watched this from 3 feet away and said nothing because there was no version of that conversation that belonged in a hotel ballroom. When we reached the center tables, I sat down beside Valerie. Wyatt sat across from us. He looked at the badge on my chest, the way someone looks at a parking ticket on someone else's car, briefly, with mild amusement. "Excuse me," he said loudly enough for the 6 people nearest to us to hear. "Are you sure you're at the right table?" I told him I was there with Valerie. He smiled, turned to acknowledge the others around us, and made a small show of graciousness. "I respect the hustle," he said, and something in the word hustle was designed to land like a diminishment. "But this table runs on real stakes. There's a floor here, financially speaking. I'm sure you understand. It's nothing personal." Frederick Morrow was 3 seats down and said nothing. 2 board members found something interesting in their wine glasses. Valerie turned toward me, and for a moment I thought still even then that she was going to say something in my defense. "Martin," she said quietly, "don't make this into something." That was the sentence that settled it. Not Wyatt's performance. Not Frederick's silence. It was 6 words from my wife that told me she had already decided which version of events she preferred, and I was not the protagonist in it. The humiliation hadn't caught her off guard. She had seen it coming and chosen her position in advance. I adjusted my cuff. I looked at Wyatt directly. "Enjoy the dinner," I said. "By Monday morning, you'll know who actually decides who stays in this room." He laughed. He thought it was the last thing a losing man says before he walks away. What he didn't know was that I stepped out onto the balcony 10 minutes later and called Lydia. I gave her 2 instructions. First, initiate a full forensic audit of Stonebridge Freight effective immediately. Second, no one was to be excluded from scope, not any department, not any executive, and not Valerie. The trust's provisions required Lydia's team to begin within 6 hours of activation. They had been prepared for this call for weeks. By the time Wyatt finished his second glass of wine, the audit was already running. Later that night, I watched Valerie and Wyatt leave the table together. He placed his hand on her waist before they reached the hallway door. She didn't move away from it. I drove home alone in my old pickup and sat in the kitchen without turning on the lights. Before dawn, Lydia called. She had found Valerie's electronic signature on 6 vendor exemption approvals, the precise decisions that had allowed Wyatt's associated companies to bypass standard due diligence and enter Stonebridge contracts without scrutiny. The speed of the discovery wasn't luck. Lydia's team had been building the evidentiary map for weeks. Formally activating the audit gave them legal standing to run the forensic analysis they had already prepared. The signatures had been there the whole time, waiting for someone with the authority to surface them. Lydia asked if I wanted to separate Valerie's file from the main investigation until I had time to think. I told her no. I understood what that answer meant. It meant the audit would go where the evidence led, regardless of who it found. It meant that whatever I had been protecting in this marriage, the idea that Valerie was someone worth protecting, was no longer the point. The point was Denise Harper, who had done everything correctly and was about to be destroyed for it. The point was 650 people who came to work at a company they didn't know was being hollowed out. I had delayed long enough trying to be careful. Being careful had only given Wyatt more time to build his defenses. I sat in that kitchen until the sun came up over the park, and I thought about the version of myself that had spent 8 years believing a half-truth was the same as a foundation. It wasn't. And now I was going to have to dismantle everything I had built on top of it, including, it turned out, everything that had been built on top of me. Wyatt moved fast. I'll give him that. Within 48 hours of the dinner at the Monarch, before Lydia's team had finished mapping the full scope of the vendor relationships, Wyatt had already identified where the threat was coming from. He didn't know about the trust. He didn't know about the forensic audit running quietly through Stonebridge's financial records. But he knew that someone inside the company had been asking questions about his contracts for months, and he knew exactly who that someone was. What he decided to do about it told me everything I needed to know about the kind of man he actually was beneath all that polish. Denise Harper became his solution. I didn't confront her. He didn't try to buy her silence or negotiate. He went straight to destruction because that was his instinct when cornered, not to defend himself, but to eliminate the person making the accusation. Using his CFO-level administrative credentials, Wyatt created a secondary user account under Denise's name and used it to access and download restricted bidding documents at 2 in the morning. He transferred a portion of that data onto a portable drive. Then he walked into her office before she arrived the following morning and left the drive in her desk drawer underneath a folder she touched every day. The security audit he requested that same afternoon was not a surprise to anyone who knew him. Wyatt ran compliance checks as a management tool. He used them to remind people he was watching. What was different this time was that he had already called Frederick before the audit began and told him what they were going to find. Frederick approved the inspection in writing within the hour. When the drive was discovered in Denise's drawer, she was escorted from the building before lunch. Her access badge was deactivated in the elevator on the way down. Her laptop was bagged and handed to Stonebridge's internal legal team before she reached the lobby. Frederick called an emergency meeting with outside counsel that afternoon, and by end of business, the word prosecution was being used in internal emails about a woman whose only actual crime had been doing her job with more precision than the people above her could tolerate. Valerie's contribution to this was not passive. She submitted a written statement to HR confirming that Denise had expressed significant bitterness about being passed over for promotion twice and had shown what Valerie described as a pattern of hostility towards senior leadership. She wrote that Denise had made several comments that, in retrospect, suggested she bore a personal grievance against the financial division. These were not observations. They were fabrications, and Valerie knew it because every formal performance review Denise had received in the past 4 years had called her thorough professional and a reliable internal resource. Valerie had access to those reviews. She had signed 2 of them herself. I found out about the suspension through Lydia, not through any official channel. I was sitting in my kitchen, the same kitchen where I'd waited for the sun to come up 2 nights before, when she called and laid out what had happened in a single, unembellished sequence of facts. When she finished, I sat with the phone in my hand and felt something settle in my chest that was colder and heavier than anger. I wanted to move immediately. I wanted to walk into that building and hand the board every document Lydia's team had compiled and end this before Denise suffered another hour of it. Lydia stopped me. "If you surface now," she said, "before we have the full forensic picture secured, Wyatt will claim the audit is personal. He'll say you found out about the affair and you're using your ownership stake to retaliate. He'll make Denise's vindication look like collateral damage in a divorce." She was right, and I hated that she was right. So I waited. Lydia's team worked through the weekend. The picture they assembled was not complicated, it was simply thorough. 3 vendors all connected to a holding company in which a close associate of Wyatt's held controlling interest. Invoices for fuel that didn't match route records. Storage fees billed against shipments that logistics data confirmed had never been held in warehouse. The overbilling across 30 months totaled $1.8 million, and a portion of that money had been routed into an investment account that Wyatt controlled through a subsidiary. Every transaction had a paper trail. Wyatt had been careful, but he hadn't been careful enough because he had never imagined anyone with the access and authority to actually look. What Lydia found in addition to the financial records changed the shape of everything. Denise had anticipated retaliation before it arrived. Weeks earlier, when Frederick's response to her 3rd report had made clear that internal escalation was going nowhere, she had done something quiet and precise. She copied every piece of externally accessible evidence, the public bidding records, the approved invoices, the email chains in which Frederick had received her warnings and responded by approving additional contracts, and saved them to her personal email and a private cloud account. She hadn't taken anything proprietary. She had preserved exactly the documents that should have been public record anyway. When Stonebridge's legal team seized her work laptop, they got nothing they hadn't already generated themselves. The real evidence was sitting untouched in an account Wyatt had no access to. The day after her suspension, Denise contacted an employment attorney and declined to sign the incident acknowledgement form Wyatt's team had couriered to her home. She understood what signing it would mean. Lydia told me Denise had essentially protected herself the same way I had been protecting the company, quietly, patiently, through proper channels without broadcasting her hand. I told Lydia to make sure her team's findings included every document Denise had preserved independently. It would matter later. While all of this was moving beneath the surface, Wyatt had been working on a different problem. He had gone back and reviewed my warning from the dinner by Monday morning. "You'll know who actually decides who stays," and decided it meant I had found out about the affair. He concluded I was planning some kind of personal confrontation, the kind an angry husband makes when he can't think of anything more effective. He was comfortable with that interpretation. It fit the story he had constructed about me. He told Valerie that I was unstable and looking for revenge. I don't know exactly what he said to her in private, but I can reconstruct the result from what happened next. She came home on a Thursday evening, stood in the kitchen doorway, and asked me why I had threatened her colleague. I told her I had not threatened anyone. I asked carefully whether there was something between her and Wyatt that I needed to know about. She looked at me for a moment without expression. "No," she said, "there isn't." She was gone by Friday morning. She took a bag and her work laptop and the coat she wore to important meetings, and she left without waking me. Within days, a divorce filing arrived through her attorney. In the supporting documentation, she described me as controlling, emotionally volatile, and fixated on her professional relationships in ways that had made her feel unsafe. She requested that Stonebridge's security team be notified, and she asked that I be added to the list of individuals restricted from entering company premises. Frederick granted the restriction the same afternoon. The board meeting Frederick called that week was designed to accomplish 3 things before the audit could go any further. First, formally terminate Denise's employment and transfer her file to the district attorney's office with a recommendation for criminal prosecution. Second, declare the ongoing audit compromised by third-party interference and shut it down. Third, approve the sale of Stonebridge's Western Logistics Division to a private investment group, a group that Lydia had already traced back to Wyatt through 2 layers of intermediary ownership. The sale was the mechanism for everything. Once the Western Division transferred to the new entity, the original vendor contracts and their associated billing records would migrate with it into a different corporate structure. chain of custody on the financial documents would fracture. Wyatt could argue that anything irregular belonged to a period of mismanagement that predated the new ownership. He would collect a transaction bonus, resign gracefully, and be gone before any investigation reached a conclusion. Frederick would get the severance Wyatt had promised him. Valerie would get the executive title they had discussed, and Denise Harper would carry a criminal record for a theft she never committed. Frederick scheduled the board meeting for Monday. Valerie was asked to present testimony confirming that the audit had originated from a domestic dispute, not a legitimate compliance concern. She agreed. I found out about all of this from Lydia on Sunday night. She talked for 20 minutes. When she finished, I asked her one question: was the forensic record complete enough to hold in a formal proceeding? She said yes. I told her to be at the Union Exchange building at 8 o'clock Monday morning with Aaron Phelps from the Colorado Financial Crimes Unit, the full audit documentation, and the trust's legal counsel. I told her to bring a copy of the trust deed, specifically the emergency governance clause that allowed the majority stakeholder to assume control of a board session in cases of documented fraud. I also told her to arrange access for Denise through Aaron's investigative authority. Her own badge had been deactivated, and I wanted her in the building before the board session began. Then I got in my truck and drove across the city in the dark. And I thought about Denise sitting in her apartment somewhere with a suspension letter and a legal bill, and no idea whether the thing she had done everything right to expose was ever going to be acknowledged. I thought about 650 people who went to work every week at a company they trusted to be run honestly. I thought about Valerie agreeing to stand in front of a board and call a legitimate investigation a marital problem. By the time I pulled back into my driveway, I had stopped thinking about any of it in terms of what it meant for me. That part of the calculation was finished. What remained was simpler and harder: show up Monday morning and let 12 years of silence do the only useful thing it had ever been positioned to do. Wyatt had spent 8 months building something he was certain I couldn't touch. He had the CEO, the board agenda, the woman I married, and a room I'd been told I wasn't wealthy enough to enter. What he didn't have, what he had never once considered looking for, was any understanding of who actually owned the room. Monday was 6 hours away. Lydia's team was ready. The evidence was complete. And Denise Harper had, without knowing it, made the case against Wyatt more airtight than even I had anticipated by preserving her own copies outside his reach. All that was left was to walk through the door he was about to try to close. I arrived at the Union Exchange building at 8:40 in the morning. The lobby was already busy, assistants moving between floors, a catering cart near the elevator bank. 2 board members I recognized from company filings signing in at the front desk. I walked to the reception counter and gave my name. The woman behind the desk typed it in, looked at her screen, and looked back at me with the careful neutrality of someone who has been trained to deliver bad news without inflection. She told me my name was on the restricted access list and that she was unable to issue me a visitor badge. I thanked her and stepped to the side. I didn't have to wait long. Wyatt and Valerie came through the main entrance together, and with them were Frederick and 3 board members who had apparently shared a car from wherever they'd had breakfast. Wyatt saw me immediately. He took in the situation in under 2 seconds. The lack of badge, the security personnel who had begun moving toward me, the fact that I was still standing there, and something that was almost pleasure crossed his face. He had orchestrated this moment as carefully as he had orchestrated the dinner at the Monarch, down to the timing of the board members' arrival. He wanted witnesses. "You still don't get it," he said, stopping a few feet away. "This isn't your room, Martin. It was never your room." Valerie stood beside him. She looked at me the way you look at something you have already decided to leave behind. Then she turned to the security personnel and said clearly and without hesitation, "Please escort him out. He has no authority here." Not "please ask him to leave." Not "I think there's been a misunderstanding." She gave an order in front of Frederick Morrow and 3 members of the Stonebridge board, using the voice she used in executive meetings when she wanted something done before anyone had time to object. That was the moment I understood completely. At the dinner, she had failed to defend me. Here, she had become the instrument of my removal. These were not the same thing, and she knew exactly what she was doing. I looked at Frederick. I looked at the board members. Then I asked in a voice loud enough to carry to the front desk and the 2 security guards and the catering staff near the elevator, whether Frederick, Valerie, and Wyatt would be willing to confirm 5 statements on the record before I left. I specified that the building's lobby cameras were running and that the board's secretary who had just walked in behind the group was present as a witness. Wyatt said yes immediately. He was certain this was the last performance of a man who had nothing left. I asked them to confirm one by one that the investigation into Denise Harper was independent and fair, that all evidence against her was original and unmanipulated, that Wyatt held no financial interest in any Stonebridge vendor, that Valerie had no personal relationship creating a conflict of interest with Wyatt, and that I, Martin Keaton, held no ownership stake or controlling interest in Stonebridge Freight Group. Frederick confirmed all 5 without hesitation. He had the practiced ease of a man who had been lying in boardrooms for long enough that it no longer registered as lying. Wyatt confirmed each point with the slight impatience of someone humoring a process he found beneath him. When it was Valerie's turn on the last statement, she looked directly at me and said, "Martin does not own anything in this company." I reached into my jacket pocket and placed the Palisade Stewardship Trust identification card on the reception desk. "You're partially right," I said. "I don't own a portion of Stonebridge." I looked at Wyatt. "I own 87% of it." The elevator behind me opened. Lydia walked out first, followed by her forensic audit team, the Trust's legal counsel, and Aaron Phelps, whom I introduced as a senior investigator with the Colorado Financial Crimes Unit. Aaron was carrying a document case. Lydia was carrying the audit report printed and bound with copies for every board member. The emergency governance clause in the Palisade Trust deed transferred control of the board session from Frederick to the majority stakeholder in cases of documented fraud. Lydia had filed the activation notice electronically at 8 that morning, which was also when Aaron had escorted Denise into the building through his investigative authority. Her own access had been revoked, but his had not. She had been waiting in a 14th floor conference room with her attorney since 8:15. Frederick's authority to chair the meeting had ended before he'd finished his breakfast. We went upstairs, all of us. The boardroom held 12 people around the table and several more along the walls. Denise sat across from the people who had spent the past week preparing to hand her file to a prosecutor. She didn't look frightened. She looked like someone who had been waiting a long time for the right people to finally be in the same room. Lydia opened by reading aloud the 5 statements that Frederick, Valerie, and Wyatt had confirmed on camera in the lobby 11 minutes earlier. She read them without commentary in the same flat, precise voice she used for everything. Then she set the transcript on the table and opened the audit report. What followed was not dramatic in the way that Wyatt's performance at the Monarch had been dramatic. It was something quieter and more final. The systematic presentation of what had actually happened, documented in financial records, access logs, security footage, and email chains that no one had thought to protect because no one had imagined they would ever be read by someone with the standing to act on them. The vendor connections were laid out first. 3 companies all linked through a holding structure to a business associate of Wyatt's. Bidding documents created after contract decisions had already been made. Fuel invoices that didn't correspond to any route data in Stonebridge's logistics system. Storage fees billed against shipments that had never entered a warehouse. $1.8 million in overbilling over 30 months with a traceable portion routed into an investment account connected to Wyatt through a subsidiary he controlled. Then the creation of the false account in Denise's name confirmed through Wyatt's own administrative credentials and the timestamp records showing the access occurred at 2 in the morning. The security footage of Wyatt's assistant carrying a laptop bag into Denise's work area the morning the planted drive was discovered. And finally, the documents Denise had preserved in her personal account, the public bidding records, the approved invoices, the email chains showing Frederick receiving her warnings and approving additional contracts in the days that followed. They had survived outside Wyatt's reach entirely, and they filled in every gap his destruction had been designed to create. Wyatt said I was using the audit to retaliate against the man who had been involved with my wife. He said it with the confidence of someone who had prepared for this argument and believed it would land. Lydia responded by presenting the timestamp on Denise's first whistleblower submission to the trust filed weeks before I had any confirmation of the affair. The investigation had not begun because of Valerie. The affair had simply ensured it could not be stopped. Wyatt stopped talking after that. Frederick attempted to position himself as an executive who had been deceived by a trusted subordinate. Lydia put 3 emails on the table, the 3 reports Denise had sent him directly, each followed within days by Frederick's approval of additional contracts from the flagged vendors. Then she showed the board the personnel file notation Frederick had entered after Denise's second report, the one designed to undermine her credibility before she could escalate further. Then she showed them the communication in which Wyatt had outlined Frederick's severance arrangement contingent on the sale of the Western Division clearing before any audit reached a conclusion. Frederick said nothing after that either. For Valerie, Lydia used only what was necessary to establish the professional misconduct, the 6 exemption approvals. The risk assessments, she had altered the internal information she had passed to Wyatt, the false performance commentary submitted to HR, and her failure to disclose a conflict of interest she had been actively concealing for 8 months. The personal messages between them were referenced only to establish that conflict. I had instructed Lydia from the beginning that the private details of the affair were not the board's business. The board's business was what Valerie had done inside the company, and that was sufficient. Before the board voted, I said one thing directly to the room. I told them that I had received Denise Harper's first report and had delayed acting on it because I wanted the evidence to be complete before I moved. I said that the delay had cost Denise her badge, her reputation, and weeks of legal exposure she should never have faced. I was the majority owner of this company. The trust's provisions gave me broad authority to act unilaterally, and I had chosen to wait. That choice had consequences for a person who had done nothing wrong, and I was not going to stand in front of them and assign all the blame to the people who had manufactured those consequences while presenting myself as entirely clean. The room was quiet after that. Then the board voted. Wyatt was removed from his CFO position immediately. His system access and financial authorizations terminated before he left the building. His full file, the vendor relationships, the false account, the planted evidence, the obstruction was transferred to Aaron's unit for criminal review. Frederick was removed as CEO, his deliberate suppression of Denise's reports, and his acceptance of a corrupt severance arrangement sufficient to end his tenure and expose him to a separate legal process. Valerie's employment was terminated for breach of fiduciary duty misrepresentation, and her role in the effort to frame a colleague for a theft she had helped enable, and her file was referred to investigators to determine criminal exposure. The sale of the Western Logistics Division was canceled before the meeting adjourned. Every charge against Denise Harper was formally withdrawn that afternoon. Stonebridge issued written documentation, confirming she had acted in precise accordance with the company's whistleblower protections, had stolen nothing, and had in fact been the only person in the organization who had consistently done what her role required. Her personnel file was corrected in full. The withheld bonuses were repaid. The income lost across 2 denied promotion cycles was calculated and issued, and her legal fees were covered by the company. I did not offer her a title. She had earned the right to be evaluated without the complication of being handed something by the person who had failed to protect her quickly enough. 4 months later, after an independent search process that considered candidates from inside and outside Stonebridge, she was appointed Chief Operating Officer. She had outperformed every other candidate on every assessment. Nobody in that process needed to do her any favors. Valerie found me in the corridor outside the boardroom after the session ended. She said Wyatt had taken advantage of her frustrations about our marriage, that he had convinced her I lacked ambition, and that she deserved more than I was willing to offer. She said she hadn't fully understood what she was helping him do. I listened to all of it. Then I told her that I had kept the truth about Palisade from her for 8 years, and that was a real failure. She had deserved to know who she was building a life with, and I had withheld that because I was afraid of what her knowing it would tell me about her. That fear was mine to own. But I also told her that nothing I had hidden had forced her hand on anything that mattered. The affair was her decision. The exemption approvals were her decisions. Writing false commentary about Denise's character and submitting it to human resources to help destroy a colleague who had done nothing to her, that was her decision, made with full knowledge of what it would do. My secrets hadn't put a pen in her hand for any of that. I did not make the divorce punishing. I didn't liquidate assets to leave her with nothing, and I didn't speak to the press. She faced what she faced through the legal system, which had arranged itself entirely from her own choices, not from anything I had engineered against her. 6 months later, it was done. I kept the house near Washington Park. I kept the old truck. What changed was that I stopped treating my own company like a place I was only allowed to observe from a distance. I joined the governance restructuring, directly built a new whistleblower system, administered by an independent outside organization, required 3 levels of approval for any vendor exemption, mandated disclosure of personal relationships between executives with overlapping approval authority, and added a provision that no majority stakeholder could indefinitely defer action when an employee faced documented retaliation risk. That last clause was a specific acknowledgement of what my waiting had cost Denise, written into the company's governing documents, where it would outlast my own tenure. The annual leadership dinner at the Monarch Ballroom was discontinued. In its place, Stonebridge created something called the Builder's Table, an annual event where invitations were issued based on documented contributions, not titles, net worth, or proximity to whoever held power that particular year. At the first one, I wore the old badge, the laminated rectangle that had said spouse guest in clean black letters the night Wyatt had read it like a verdict. Denise noticed it on the table in front of me and asked why I still had it. I told her it reminded me how thoroughly a room full of people can misread a person when the only thing they're looking at is what that person chooses to display. She considered that for a moment, then nodded slowly in the way someone nods when a thing that happened to them has finally been given accurate language. I left the badge on the table when the evening ended, right where Wyatt had once told me I had no business sitting. No one asked me that night whether I belonged there. They already knew the answer. And more importantly, so did I. The most dangerous assumption you can make about someone is that their silence means they have nothing. Wyatt built an entire plan around the idea that a man without a visible price tag had no power worth accounting for. He was so focused on the room he thought he owned that he never once looked at the deed. Real strength doesn't always announce itself. It doesn't need the right table, the right badge, or the right title. It shows up when it matters, does what needs to be done, and then goes home in an old truck without asking for applause. If this story stayed with you, if you've ever been the person in the room with the wrong badge, share it with someone who needs to hear it. And if you haven't already, subscribing to the channel is the easiest way to make sure you don't miss the next one. There are more stories like this coming, and every single one of them is worth your time.